So for the second part of our video on Marxist theory, we're going to talk about the use of ideology as a tool of oppression. And so ideology basically means the belief system or systems we have that are based on cultural conditioning and that underline our actions and material lives. So they are basically the different philosophies or stories or ideas that we share within a culture to explain why we do things, why we buy things, how we interact with each other. It's sort of all these kind of like underlying ideas that explain why we do what we do. I'm going to give you a few examples as we go through. The first is an example of how we think about children. So oftentimes here in sort of 21st century United States, we think about children as inherently sweet and innocent and to be protected. So that's why you might hear people making arguments about like kids should have a chance to be kids. They don't need to have homework. They should be able to go home and play. That's because we have a very specific understanding of what childhood is. But in other times, children weren't thought of as sort of inherently sweet and innocent, but inherently wild. And that's kind of what we see here in Peter Pan with the Lost Boys. You can even say the Lost Boys are wearing animal costumes, right? That without the influence of parents, they have reverted to an animal state. And so if we believe that children are inherently sort of wild or savage, we treat them differently than if we believe that they are sweet and innocent. For example, we would think about education as a tool for civilizing children. We might think about um, like observing our children or surveilling our children as a way to keep all of our stuff safe, right? Keep our stuff safe, keep maybe our pets safe, keep our neighbors safe from folks who haven't really worked out morality yet and they don't know what's right or wrong. As opposed to if we believe a child is sort of naturally sweet and innocent, we look over it to make sure um, that it's not in any danger from outside forces. So this is just kind of one example of ideology, right? The way that we think about children's sort of natural state um, defines how we treat and interact with children. Here's another example. The example of the different genders' relationship with emotions. So a lot of the time we will have the idea that women are more emotional than men unless the emotion we're talking about is anger. In which case we are often asked to admire men's anger or at least make space for men's anger, right? That it's sort of natural for them to be angry and that their anger sort of has a positive effect in a lot of cases. It gets stuff done. But when women are angry, it's unfeminine, it's scary, it shows that she's kind of lost control. And so one way to exemplify this is the two different athletes who are arguing with refs. On the left, you'll see Serena Williams, and on the right, you'll see a baseball player named Boone. Sorry, I don't know his first name. But the way the news covers their disagreement with referees is that Serena has the mother of all meltdowns, but for Boone, he's arguing a strike and that the Yankees rally afterwards. Right? The language is very different, even though Boone's stance is more aggressive because he's in the ref's face rather than Serena Williams, who's farther away. Right? She can't sort of get right in the ref's face from that position. So here we kind of see how men and women's anger is treated differently in the media based on the ideas our society has about who it's appropriate to feel and display anger. So when we're talking about ideology, a Marxist would argue a few different things. First, they would argue that ideology appears naturally. For the people who live in that society at that time, they think it's just the way things are. And this is why it's really helpful to learn about other societies in different time periods because you'll see that they have different ideologies from ours. And so it forces us to examine our own ideology because we can see that it isn't the only way to live. A Marxist also would argue that ideology permeates our social institutions and our texts. So texts has a really broad definition here. It might mean something that you're reading, but it could be a work of art, it could be a film, it could be a play, It's really anything where people consume ideas. It could be an internet article, right? Anywhere where people consume ideas would be a text. And so ideologies are learned through those institutions and through those texts, right? If we're watching um, Sesame Street, children partially get out of Sesame Street how they're supposed to behave with one another. And similarly, adults, watching television shows can see how we're supposed to behave with one another, how we're supposed to treat each other. Um, Further, a Marxist would argue that ideology can encourage people to ignore history and material conditions that conflict with the ideology. So for that, I wanted to bring in the image that we have here, which is someone pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. It's a very American ideology that with hard work, anyone can improve themselves. Um, it's very much kind of built into our culture. And so because that is so built in, it encourages us to forget the things that get in the way of people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, right? It might forget the history where some people experienced much harsher oppression than others, and so it's difficult to kind of recover from that, from the material conditions, right? A person who is homeless might be willing and able to work very hard to better themselves. But if they don't have an address, they might not be able to get a job. And if they don't have a job, they won't be able to get an address. And so they're kind of stuck in this circle. But because of our ideology, the idea that if you work hard enough, you can better yourself, we often ignore those other factors that don't line up with the ideology. Ideology is also used to maintain power. So it's often perpetuated by the people who are in power and everybody else because it's soaked into the fabric of our everyday life. But it often is used to maintain the current power structure. So if we believe that everyone who works hard can better themselves, and then we see someone who is unable to better themselves, we assume that it's because they didn't work hard enough instead of examining the systems of power that might have made it incredibly hard for them to better themselves. Right? So it maintains these systems of power. We don't have to look at the people up top and think about their possible influence on what's going on with the people at the bottom, right? We just assume that the people at the bottom were too lazy to do any better. And then the last thing that a Marxist might argue about ideology is that it is shared through every level of society, micro and macro. So we might see it in our big institutions, in our government policies, in our interactions with other nations, and we might see it in small examples, like a parent choosing which book to read to their child, right? Even a children's book has ideology kind of baked into it. And so the child learns ideology from the stories their parents choose to tell them. After this, we're going to talk a little bit about capitalism, and this wraps up what we have for ideology for today.